27,000 feet above the skies of occupied France, the summer of 1944. A German fighter pilot, a veteran of the Eastern Front, watches with a growing sense of dread. Below him, endless columns of American Sherman tanks roll through the Norman countryside, their treads churning up dusty roads. He's seen tanks before, thousands of them, but never like this. Every tank his comrades destroy, every column bombed, seems to be instantly replaced by another. It's like a mechanical hydra, sprouting two new heads for every one cut off. How was this possible? For years, the German High Command had dismissed American industrial capacity as irrelevant. A nation weakened by depression, obsessed with consumer goods, far across the Atlantic, surely they could not project power on such a scale. Yet, here it was. Entire tank armies, aircraft fleets, vast navies, seemingly conjured from thin air, materializing on battlefields across the globe. It was a transformation unparalleled in human history, a contradiction that defied every pre-war expectation, and a strategic dilemma that would ultimately decide the fate of nations. The central question is not merely how America produced so much, but how quickly it managed to replace entire military forces, turning its factories into the ultimate weapon, outproducing its enemies to a degree that crippled their will to fight. What was the secret to this seemingly miraculous industrial surge, and how did it happen against all odds? To understand this, we must first rewind to a world teetering on the brink, a world where America was profoundly different. In the mid-1930s, the United States was a sleeping giant, deeply scarred by the Great Depression. Its military was a shadow of European powers, the army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. Its industrial might, while vast, was geared almost entirely towards civilian production. Automobiles, refrigerators, radios, and washing machines. Isolationism was the prevailing political mood. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were seen as impenetrable barriers, shielding America from the growing storm in Europe and Asia. Across the globe, however, a different reality was taking shape. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had unleashed a massive rearmament program, building a formidable military machine fueled by state-directed industry. In Japan, an expansionist empire was consolidating its hold on Manchuria and eyeing resource-rich Southeast Asia. Both nations were pouring immense resources into tanks, aircraft, and warships, preparing for conquest. Their leaders, watching America's internal struggles, saw little to fear from a nation seemingly unwilling and unable to fight. This was the strategic dilemma facing President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He understood the grave threat. He saw the rise of fascism in Europe and militarism in Asia. Yet, he also faced an American public deeply committed to neutrality. The memory of World War I and the economic devastation that followed made any foreign entanglement deeply unpopular. How could he prepare a nation for a war it didn't want to fight? How could he transform an industrial behemoth from civilian production to war production without triggering widespread opposition? It was a political decision fraught with immense risk. Roosevelt's first gambit was a masterclass in political maneuvering. In a fireside chat on December 29, 1940, with war raging in Europe and Britain standing alone, he introduced the concept of America as the arsenal of democracy. He argued that the US did not need to send its sons to fight, but it absolutely must provide the tools for those who were fighting. The idea was simple. Instead of joining the war, America would become the industrial engine powering the Allied fight for freedom. This shifted the strategic narrative from direct intervention to essential support. But rhetoric alone could not build a single tank. The practical challenge was immense. At this point, the US produced only a handful of tanks annually, nowhere near enough for even a small modern army, let alone to supply Britain. Its factories were designed for cars, not armored vehicles. The engines, the transmissions, the steel armor, everything needed massive retooling and new supply chains. The transformation began subtly, almost secretly. Roosevelt appointed William S. Knudsen, a Danish immigrant and former General Motors executive, to head the Office of Production Management. Knudsen was a titan of industry, known for his ability to organize and innovate. He understood the scale of the task, converting the world's largest consumer economy into its largest war machine. This was the first major technological gamble. Could the principles of mass production, honed for automobiles, be applied to the complex, bespoke world of military hardware? The answer was far from certain. In 1940, as German panzer divisions swept through France, American industry was still hesitant. Many manufacturers worried about disrupting their civilian production lines, fearing a return to the Depression once the war ended. The military itself had its own set of challenges. Its procurement system was slow, bureaucratic, and often favored quality over quantity, a luxury the evolving global conflict could no longer afford. The initial US Army tank, the M3 Lee, was a compromise, quickly designed to get anything into production. It had a peculiar, multi-gun turret layout that reflected the hurried nature of its development. Then came the morning of December 7th, 1941. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack ripped through American complacency. The war was no longer a distant European conflict. It was here. This brutal surprise attack was the ultimate catalyst, unifying a divided nation and removing any remaining doubt about the necessity of total war. The strategic problem instantly escalated. America now faced enemies on two fronts, Japan in the Pacific and Germany in Europe. The military demands became astronomical. President Roosevelt set seemingly impossible targets: 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943. He called for 45,000 tanks in 1942 alone. These numbers dwarfed the combined production of all Axis nations. German intelligence, monitoring these pronouncements, dismissed them as propaganda, a delusional fantasy from a nation incapable of such feats. This was their fundamental misconception, an underestimation born of arrogance that would prove devastating. But Knudsen and his team understood the potential. They looked at the vast automobile plants of Detroit, the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the burgeoning aircraft factories in California. They saw not just car assembly lines, but the raw material, the engineering talent, and the skilled labor that could be repurposed. Consider the example of the M4 Sherman tank. While not the most heavily armored or powerfully armed tank of the war, especially when compared to the German Panther or Tiger, its strength lay in a different area: its manufacturability. The decision was made to produce the Sherman in vast quantities, focusing on reliability, ease of maintenance, and above all, speed of production. This was the core strategic doctrine: overwhelm the enemy with numbers. Inside the sprawling Chrysler Detroit tank arsenal, the former home of automotive innovation, a new kind of assembly line was taking shape. Before the war, this massive plant was an empty shell, a symbol of industrial potential waiting for a purpose. Now it roared to life. Engineers and workers, many of whom had previously built cars, faced a steep learning curve. Welding thick armor plate was different from joining body panels. Installing a 75mm cannon required different precision than fitting an engine block. But the American genius for standardization and interchangeable parts, honed over decades in the automotive industry, proved invaluable. Components for Sherman tanks could be produced in multiple factories, then shipped to final assembly lines. Different variants of the Sherman, with different engines, radial aircraft engines, Ford V8S, or even diesel engines, allowed for flexibility in production and lessened reliance on a single supply chain. This was a direct result of the lessons learned from consumer product manufacturing. The impact was immediate and dramatic. By 1942, the Chrysler arsenal was producing 1,000 Sherman tanks a month. Soon, other companies joined in: Ford, General Motors, Baldwin Locomotive Works, Pacific Car and Foundry. The numbers began to climb at an astonishing rate. The experience of Henry Kaiser offers another compelling illustration of this unprecedented industrial transformation. Kaiser, a civil engineer industrialist, had built his reputation on massive construction projects, including the Hoover Dam. He was a man who challenged conventional wisdom, a characteristic that would become central to America's war effort. When the need for transport ships became desperate, Allied shipping losses to German U-boats in the Atlantic were catastrophic. Kaiser proposed a radical idea: mass-produced, modular cargo ships built in days, not months. His shipyards, notably in Richmond, California, became a crucible of innovation. Workers, many of them women new to the industrial workforce, built sections of Liberty ships simultaneously. These sections were then welded together in a continuous assembly line. This was the equivalent of building cars on a grand scale, but for ships. The process was astonishingly fast. What previously took a year now took weeks. By 1943, Liberty ships were rolling off the ways at a rate of 3 a day. The Germans could sink them, but Kaiser's yards could replace them faster. This was a direct example of the rise and fall, the rise of American production capacity and the fall of the U-boat's effectiveness. The same principles were applied to aircraft. The B-24 Liberator bomber, initially a complex and demanding aircraft to produce, was simplified and standardized for mass production at Ford's Willow Run plant. This facility, originally designed for automotive parts, was transformed into an aerospace giant. At its peak, Willow Run was producing a B-24 every 63 minutes. Imagine the sheer scale. An aircraft the size of a modern passenger jet, complete with 4 engines, bomb bays, and multiple machine guns, assembled faster than many families could prepare dinner. These were not isolated examples. From small arms to artillery, from trucks to jeeps, from ammunition to uniforms, every aspect of American industry was mobilized. The number of active American factories more than doubled during the war. Millions of new workers, including a significant proportion of women entering the workforce for the first time, streamed into these plants, often working grueling shifts. Rosie the Riveter became a national icon, symbolizing the immense contribution of women to the war effort. This was the human cost and triumph behind the statistics. The strategic implications were profound. In the vastness of the Pacific, the US Navy, shattered at Pearl Harbor, rebuilt itself with bewildering speed. New aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were launched at a pace that dwarfed Japan's capacity. By 1944, the US Navy was larger than all other navies combined, a fact that would have seemed utterly impossible 3 years prior. This overwhelming naval power was crucial for island-hopping campaigns and projecting force across vast distances. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces, while possessing their own formidable industrial capacity and fighting spirit, were also heavily reliant on American Lend-Lease supplies. Thousands of American trucks, locomotives, and even complete factories shipped across the globe helped sustain the Soviet war machine against the Wehrmacht. It's a historical irony that the Soviet Union, ostensibly a rival ideology, owed a significant part of its wartime survival to American capitalism. The Germans, trapped in a two-front war, began to feel the crushing weight of this industrial imbalance. Their tanks, while often technologically superior in individual engagements, were complex, required specialized parts, and took enormous time and skilled labor to produce. A single Tiger tank could take months to build. A Panther tank was a marvel of engineering, but its sophisticated design meant it was prone to breakdowns and difficult to repair in the field. Every loss was painful, every replacement a massive drain on resources. In contrast, the Sherman tank, though outgunned by the Tiger and Panther, was robust, relatively easy to maintain, and crucially, incredibly abundant. Allied commanders adopted a doctrine of numerical superiority. If one Sherman couldn't take out a Tiger, 10 could. For every Sherman lost, 2 more seemed to arrive from the ports of France or the deserts of North Africa. This continuous flow created an unexpected outcome. It negated the quality advantage of German armor through sheer weight of numbers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, understood this better than anyone. He once remarked that the war was won by the GI in the field and the workers in the factories. The flow of material allowed Allied forces to absorb losses and maintain relentless pressure. It meant that even after devastating battles like the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944, where thousands of tanks and vehicles were destroyed, American and British forces could recover and rearm within weeks. German forces, after the same battle, were left with irreplaceable losses in men and machines. The constant resupply enabled campaigns of attrition that Axis powers simply could not match. The strategic dilemma for Germany became stark: how to fight a war of attrition against an enemy whose industrial base was effectively infinite. Their tactical victories often produced strategic defeats because they could not replenish their forces. This was the ultimate contradiction. Their initial triumphs, built on speed and technological superiority, were undermined by an enemy whose strength lay in a slow, relentless, and overwhelming flood of materiel. The Allied air forces also saw their ranks swell to unprecedented levels. The P-47 Thunderbolt fighter, a heavy and robust aircraft, rolled off assembly lines in the thousands. Despite initial skepticism about its weight and maneuverability, its durability in combat and ability to carry significant bomb loads made it a feared ground attack platform. As with the Sherman, its strength was its abundance. German pilots, even highly skilled aces, found themselves facing waves of P-47S, P-51 Mustangs, and Spitfires. Their own factories, constantly under Allied bombing, struggled to keep pace. By the end of the war, more than 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts alone had been produced, a number that utterly overwhelmed German fighter production. The economic consequences of this industrial mobilization were profound. The US economy exploded, pulling itself out of the Depression with an urgency and scale that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Unemployment virtually vanished. This created an entirely new set of problems: labor shortages, inflation. But these were the problems of prosperity, not scarcity. The story of America's factories replacing entire tank armies in weeks is not just a tale of machines and numbers. It is a story of human ingenuity, relentless determination, and extraordinary adaptation. It's the story of politicians making bold decisions, industrialists taking audacious gambles, and millions of ordinary citizens transforming their lives to meet an existential threat. It's the story of a nation discovering its true potential under immense pressure. By war's end, the United States had produced nearly 90,000 tanks, over 300,000 aircraft, 2.4 million trucks, 6.5 million rifles, and 40 billion rounds of ammunition. It had built 6,500 naval vessels, including 27 aircraft carriers. These are not just statistics. They represent an industrial achievement that fundamentally altered the course of the war. Every tank, every plane, every ship represented an answer to the desperate pleas of the Allies and a crushing blow to the Axis. The transformation was complete. The contradiction between pre-war expectations and wartime reality had been resolved through sheer industrial power. The misconception that America was too slow or too soft had been decisively overturned. The strategic dilemma of how to fight a global war on multiple fronts was met with an answer of overwhelming material superiority. The legacy of this period extends far beyond the end of World War II. It established the United States as the undisputed economic and industrial superpower, a position it would hold for decades. It fundamentally reshaped the American economy, labor force, and even its social fabric, forever changing the role of women and minorities in industry. The arsenal of democracy proved to be not just a wartime slogan, but a blueprint for global power projection. The unexpected outcome of this incredible feat was not just victory, but a complete redefinition of modern warfare. It showed that military might was no longer solely about the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of generals, but also about the immense, sustained power of a nation's industrial base. In the end, the war was won not just by men and machines on the battlefield, but by the relentless, often unseen roar of factories across America, turning raw materials into tools of liberation, replacing entire tank armies in what felt like weeks, and fundamentally changing the world forever.